Emily walked down the road, her mind miles away. The sounds of laughter and children playing filled the air. As she made her way home from work, she looked up at the setting sun, thinking of how life had changed since her father's passing. Her once bright dreams of studying were now fading under the weight of family responsibilities. Emily often wondered if life would always feel this heavy. She hoped to find a way to pursue her education, but with her family's financial struggles, it felt impossible. Despite her beauty and intelligence, she had turned down countless suitors, convinced that she needed to build a life on her own terms before settling down. All she wanted was to be an independent woman. The only person who truly understood her dreams was her father, but now he was no more. He was the only one who truly believed in school. He always encouraged her to study when Emily was younger, but her mother, Margaret, she only talked about practicality and finding a good man to help lift the family out of poverty. Emily glanced over her shoulder to see a sleek, black car rolling to a stop. The driver was a man, tall and striking, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Can I offer you a lift?" Emily shook her head, quickening her pace. "Thank you, but no." "Then maybe I can offer you dinner? I know a lovely place nearby," he persisted, his voice friendly but insistent. She looked at him, her gaze firm. "I'm sorry, I have to go." The man laughed, undeterred. "Then I'll see you around. I'm David, by the way." Emily sighed, watching a group of young women, all dressed in fashionable clothes, laughing as they passed her. They were girls from well-off families, the kind who could afford to talk about dreams and futures, without having to worry about money or family obligations. She didn't resent them. Instead, she envied the freedom they had. She quickened her pace, determined to push those feelings aside. Even if she wanted to change her circumstances, she would do it on her own. She hated it when women thought that men were their only road out of poverty. "Emily," the voice startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to see her mother standing at the front gate, so beautiful with her hands on her hips. Margaret, her mother, had always been a beautiful woman. She had won the most beautiful girl in her school during her secondary school days. Even up till now, men still stared at her agape. She was the definition of beauty, tall, compounded with a good body stature. Her husband's death took a toll on her, but that still didn't take away her beauty. People said that Emily took her facial beauty from her mother. "Where have you been? You know we need your help around the house," Margaret called, her tone both firm and weary. "Mom, Lagos traffic is something else today, and I still went to the market," Emily replied, holding up the black sack bag. "We were out of vegetables, and I managed to get a good deal." Margaret's face softened. She approached her daughter and took the bag, glancing inside with a slight nod of approval. "Good girl. You are just like your father. I know I can always count on you." They walked together toward the small, run-down house that had been their home for years. Emily's younger siblings, her 2 brothers and 2 sisters, played in the front yard with other neighbors, their laughter ringing out in the fading light. Emily's heart swelled with love for them, even as she felt the burden of responsibility weigh heavily on her shoulders. She used to play like that, but everything stopped after her father's death. The death of her father turned her into a grown woman, mostly with the thought of family growth. As they stepped inside, Margaret set the bag on the counter and began unpacking it. Emily joined her, moving in the familiar rhythm of household chores. Silence settled between them, comfortable but tense. Margaret's gaze flickered toward Emily, as if she were debating whether to say something. "Emily," she finally spoke, her voice low, "have you thought any more about your future?" Emily paused, feeling a pang in her chest. They had this conversation often, but it was never easy. "You mean about marriage?" Margaret nodded. "You're a beautiful girl. You've had plenty of suitors from good families. I know you want more from life. But maybe it's time to think about what's practical." Emily swallowed, feeling the familiar ache in her throat. "Mom, you know I want to go to university. I want to do something with my life. Getting married now, it would only put me further from that goal. I want to be an independent woman. Mom, I don't want to be a housewife." Her mother sighed. looking at her with a mix of affection and exasperation. No one is asking you to be a housewife. Your husband can start any trade for you. University is expensive, Emily. And even if you went, there's no guarantee it would lead to anything better. Some of the traders in the market are all graduates. We don't have the luxury of dreams, not like those other girls. Emily looked away, blinking back tears. She knew her mother was right in some ways. The weight of their circumstances pressed down on her every day, a constant reminder that her dreams might be out of reach. But she couldn't help hoping, even if that hope felt like a betrayal of the family that depended on her. They worked in silence, the only sounds the clinking of dishes and the voices of her siblings in the background. Emily's thoughts drifted, her mind filled with memories of late nights spent studying by candlelight, and the ache of knowing that those dreams might never come to pass. Suddenly, a car's horn blared outside, startling both women. They exchanged a surprised look before moving to the door, peering out at the sleek, luxurious car parked at the edge of their yard. It was a beautiful, luxurious car, the kind of car that belonged to wealthy people. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a commanding presence, dressed in a crisp suit that seemed almost out of place in the dusty town. His hair was dark, slicked back, and he had an air of confidence that was both intriguing and intimidating. Emily's heart skipped a beat as he approached. She thought it was the same man she had seen on her way home, but it wasn't. The one standing outside was another person. Emily could feel her mother's gaze on her, a silent question hanging in the air. The man stopped a few steps from them, a charming smile on his face. "Good evening, ma'am," he greeted them, his voice smooth and confident. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I was hoping to speak to Emily." Emily's cheeks flushed. To me?" He nodded, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel both flattered and wary. "Yes, I've seen you around town a few times. I hope you don't find this forward, but I felt compelled to introduce myself. My name is David." "David again?" Emily screamed surprisedly. "Any problem?" the man asked. Emily shook her head. She didn't know when those words slipped out of her mouth, but it seemed confusing. The one she met on her way home was David, and the one standing before her was another. David. She swallowed hard. Margaret's gaze shifted between the two of them, her expression thoughtful. She wondered the kind of gut David had. How could he come to her house to see Emily? "Well, David," she said slowly, "Emily is busy. You can't speak with her today." "All right, ma'am. I just don't like the idea of stopping young girls on the road. It is not good for their reputation. So I tried all my best to find out where she lives. I don't know if I'm wrong, but that's how I do my thing," David explained. "You did well. It shows that you came from a good family. But it is already late, and Emily is in the kitchen," Margaret said. David's smile didn't falter. "I understand, ma'am, but perhaps I could offer Emily a ride home sometime? It's the least I could do." Emily hesitated, glancing at her mother, who looked back at her with a hint of expectation in her eyes. She could sense her mother's silent approval, a subtle push in David's direction. I suppose that would be fine," Emily said softly, unsure of what she was agreeing to. David's smile widened. "Excellent. I'll look forward to it then." He gave a polite nod to Margaret before turning and getting back into his car, driving off with a wave. As the dust settled, Emily felt a strange unease. She looked at her mother, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "He seems like a nice man," Margaret said, her tone almost casual, but there was a glint in her eyes that told Emily she was already considering what David might bring into their lives. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. She had always wanted more from life, but she wasn't sure this was the kind of more she had in mind. Still, as she watched the car disappear down the road, she couldn't deny the spark of curiosity that had been ignited. That night, as she lay in bed, she found herself replaying the encounter in her mind, wondering about the man who had suddenly appeared in her life. Among all the suitors she had, David seemed to be more calm and gentle. She barely knew him, yet he had a way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. Maybe he was the beginning of something different, something better. Or maybe, she thought with a pang of doubt, he was simply another distraction from the life she had already resigned herself to. As the hours stretched on, she stared up at the wall clock, torn between the weight of her responsibilities and the lure of something unknown, something that whispered of a life beyond this one, beyond the dusty roads and the long nights of quiet sacrifice. She knew that her mother would be mad with her if she rejected David again. The weeks after David's initial visit passed in a blur of mixed emotions for Emily. David continued to appear along her route to the office, often arriving in his car just as she was making her way home, timing his stops with an accuracy that left her both flattered and apprehensive. At first, Emily resisted. She barely knew him, and there was something too sudden, too unexpected about the way he'd swept into her life. But David was nothing if not persistent. His charm was effortless, his words persuasive. Slowly, against her better judgment, Emily allowed him into her routine. The drives he offered her became their small ritual. They were short, lasting just minutes, but within the confines of his car, Emily felt like she was stepping into a different world where her dreams and aspirations didn't feel so far-fetched. David would ask her about her life, her family, her goals, and he would listen with rapt attention, his gaze focused entirely on her, as though she was the only person in the world. She felt seen, and his attention was like sunlight on her skin, something warm and intoxicating. One evening, after another shared ride, David surprised her by saying, "Emily, I'd like to marry you." Emily felt her heart skip. For a moment, she thought he was joking, that this was some playful remark made in jest. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw that he was serious. His expression was open, vulnerable even, and she felt her pulse quicken. "David," she stammered, struggling to find her voice. "We barely know each other. Marriage, it's not something I can just decide on so quickly." David nodded, his expression unchanging. "I know it seems sudden, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I want to take care of you, Emily. I want to give you a life where you don't have to worry about where the next meal is coming from, or whether you'll ever get a chance to go to school. I can give you that." Emily's mind raced. Here was this man, offering her a chance to escape from the life she'd known, the daily struggle to keep her family afloat. Yet, the idea of marrying a man she barely knew felt like betraying her dreams, the dreams she'd held close to her heart for as long as she could remember. I don't know, David," she whispered, looking down. "I've always wanted to go to school. I can't give that up." David leaned forward, his eyes softening. "Emily, if you marry me, I promise to support whatever you want to do. You want to go to school? I'll make it happen. All I ask is that you give me the chance to make you happy." His words stirred something in her, a mixture of hope and apprehension. He was offering her everything she'd wanted, a future where she could pursue her dreams without the weight of poverty hanging over her. And yet, something held her back, a tiny voice whispering that she was trading one set of chains for another. Later that night, Emily confided in her mother. They sat in front of their corridor, enjoying the moonlight and cold breeze. Margaret listened intently, her expression thoughtful. When Emily finished speaking, Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Emily," she said quietly, "this is a chance for us, all of us. If you marry David, he'll not only take care of you but the entire family. We wouldn't have to struggle like this anymore. Think of your siblings. Think of the future you'd be giving them." Emily's heart twisted. She wanted to believe her mother's words, to trust that this was the right path. But deep down, she felt a pang of fear, a sense that this decision was pulling her away from the life she had imagined for herself. "But, Mom," she replied, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I love him. Marriage should be about more than just money. I think love should be the ultimate." Margaret's gaze hardened, her tone sharpening. "Love doesn't put food on the table, Emily. We can't afford to live in a fantasy. This man is offering you everything you've ever wanted. If you don't take this chance, you may never get another." Who is talking about love? Thunder fire that love. Emily felt a weight settle over her, the crushing realization that her dreams of independence were slipping away. She wanted to fight, to hold onto her hopes, but her mother's words echoed in her mind, drowning out her protests. In the end, she agreed, more out of resignation than excitement. I hope you are enjoying the stories. Please leave your comments below and subscribe to my channel. Thanks. The wedding was an elaborate wedding full of people. David was a businessman, so he had many guests, friends, customers, business partners. David stood at the altar, his gaze unwavering as he took her hand, and for a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was the right choice. Perhaps, in time, she would come to love him. After the ceremony, they moved into a luxurious and comfortable home. For the first few months, life with David was a strange mixture of contentment and unease. He was attentive, showering her with gifts and affection, making her feel like a queen in a palace. He took her to restaurants, introduced her to his colleagues, and even enrolled her in a small private lesson where she could begin to take classes in preparation for JAM, Joint Administration and Matriculation Board. Emily found herself settling into the rhythm of married life, her days filled with classes and evenings spent with David. She began to hope that perhaps she had made the right decision, that this marriage could be more than a mere arrangement. But slowly, imperceptibly, David's behavior began to change. It started with small things, a missed dinner here, a late night there. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself that he was just busy with work. But the late nights grew more frequent, and his excuses became more vague. He would come home smelling of perfume, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes avoiding hers. Emily felt a knot of dread forming in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, unwilling to confront the possibility that her husband might be unfaithful. She had sacrificed too much, invested too much in this marriage to let doubt ruin it. Instead, she waited, hoping that whatever was pulling him away would eventually pass. One evening, after a particularly long night of waiting, Emily finally worked up the courage to confront him. They sat in the living room, the tension thick between them as she voiced her concerns, her words tumbling out in a rush of frustration and fear. "David, I feel like you're slipping away," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You come home late, you don't talk to me. I feel like a stranger in my own home." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, you're overreacting. I'm just busy with work. You have no idea the pressure I'm under. My container is on the way and I am trying to sort things out. It is not easy. But it's more than that," she pressed, her voice breaking. "I know you're hiding something from me." He stood, his face hardening. "Emily, you don't understand what it takes to make a marriage work. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Just trust me." With that, he walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the silence of their home. Emily felt a wave of despair wash over her, the realization that the life she had imagined was crumbling around her. She wanted to believe his words, to trust that he would return to the man he had once been if the container arrived. But the growing distance between them was like a dark cloud, casting shadows over every corner of her life. Feeling lost, Emily turned to the one person she had always trusted, her mother. She called Margaret, her voice trembling as she recounted the changes in David, the late nights, the coldness that had settled between them. Her mother listened in silence, her responses calm and measured, as though she had expected this all along. "Emily," Margaret said finally, "marriage is hard work. Men are complicated. But if you want to make it work, you have to be strong. Show him that you won't tolerate being disrespected." Emily clung to her mother's words, finding solace in her advice. She didn't want to give up on her marriage, not after everything she had sacrificed. She resolved to fight for it, to find a way to reach David and remind him of the promises they had made. But as the weeks passed, David's behavior only grew more distant. He spent less time at home, his attention drifting away from her, and the small acts of kindness that had once defined their relationship disappeared entirely. Emily began to feel like a ghost in her own life, trapped in a marriage that felt more like a prison. And yet, she held on, hoping that somehow, things would change, that David would return to her. As the days stretched into weeks, Emily found herself wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. She had chosen money over love, stability over freedom, and now she was paying the price. But deep down, She still held onto a sliver of hope, a small, fragile belief that her marriage could be saved. And so, she stayed, waiting in the shadows, clinging to the faintest glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded her. Emily tried to follow her mother's advice, summoning every ounce of strength she could to hold on to her marriage. She threw herself into her studies, seeking solace in the world of books and knowledge, a place where her mind was free from worry and doubt. Yet each night, she returned home to the same uneasy silence, a space that felt colder with each passing day. David's behavior remained erratic. There were days when he would leave early in the morning and not return until late at night, his expression weary but closed off. When he did come home, he was a shadow of the man she had once known, distant, distracted, and often avoiding her altogether. Emily began to suspect that there was more to his absences than work. The lingering scent of perfume on his shirts, the faint lipstick stains she occasionally found on his collar, all pointed to something far more sinister than long hours at the office. Still, she hesitated to confront him. She was afraid. Afraid of the truth, afraid of the pain that would follow, afraid of losing the fragile stability she had clung to since their wedding day. But as her fears grew, so did her mother's involvement. Margaret was never more than a phone call away, and Emily found herself confiding in her mother more frequently, sharing every detail of her growing despair. Margaret listened patiently, offering words of comfort and advice, her tone gentle but firm. "Emily," Margaret would say, "sometimes men stray, but that doesn't mean they don't love their wives. You just have to remind him of why he married you. Show him that you're still the woman he fell in love with." Emily took her mother's words to heart, throwing herself into the role of the devoted wife. She prayed, cooked David's favorite meals, kept the house immaculate, and dressed in the outfits she knew he liked. But despite her efforts, David's distance only grew. It was as though he was slipping through her fingers, an enigma she could no longer understand. One evening, after yet another long day of waiting, Emily made the difficult decision to reach out to her mother directly. She dialed Margaret's number, her hands trembling as she waited for her mother to answer. When Margaret picked up, her voice was warm, reassuring, and it soothed Emily's frayed nerves. "Mom," Emily began, struggling to keep her voice steady, I think David is having an affair. I don't know what to do anymore." "Affair? Are you sure?" "Yes, I am sure, Mom. The handwriting is on the wall. I am no longer a child. I know when I see a cheating man, and I can tell you categorically that David is one. He is having an affair." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. "Emily, darling, I understand how hard this is for you. But you have to remember that marriage is a commitment. Men have their flaws, but if you want to keep your family together, you have to be strong." Emily swallowed, a wave of frustration washing over her. "But Mom, it's more than that. He's barely home. He doesn't talk to me. I feel like I'm losing him." "Then you need to remind him of who you are," Margaret replied firmly. "I don't want to sound this way, but all men cheat, including some men of God. It is in their genetics. See what will happen? I'll come and stay with you for a while. Maybe that will help." Emily felt a surge of relief. Her mother's presence had always been a source of comfort, a steady anchor in the stormy sea of her life. If anyone could help her navigate this, it was Margaret. The following week, Margaret arrived, her presence filling the house with a warmth that Emily hadn't felt in months. David seemed to notice too, for he began coming home earlier, spending more time at the house as though he were on his best behavior. Emily watched him carefully, noting the way he avoided her mother's gaze, how he seemed to tense whenever Margaret entered the room. Margaret stayed with them for a month, during which time David's behavior changed remarkably. He was attentive, present, and even affectionate, the man Emily had once fallen in love with. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt hopeful. She began to believe that perhaps her mother's presence was the key, that David simply needed a reminder of what he stood to lose. But even as she clung to that hope, a tiny voice nagged at the back of her mind, whispering doubts she couldn't quite ignore. Perhaps David had started speaking with those girls only on the phone. She thought of begging her mother to stay with them for another month. She knew that her mother wouldn't agree because of her younger ones, but she was ready to try her luck. One afternoon, Emily confided in her friend, Rebecca, a woman she had met at her lesson. They sat in a quiet cafe, the aroma of coffee and pastries filling the air as Emily poured out her heart, recounting every detail of her husband's behavior and her mother's involvement. Rebecca listened carefully, her brow furrowed as she sipped her coffee. When Emily finished, Rebecca was silent for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Emily," Rebecca said slowly, "I don't want to alarm you, but has it ever occurred to you that maybe there's more going on between David and your mother than you realize?" Emily felt a jolt of shock, a chill running down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rebecca hesitated, her eyes searching Emily's face. "I don't want to make you worry without reason, but sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. You've told me how David changes when your mother is around, how he's afraid of her, but also how he behaves better when she's there. Maybe she's involved in ways you haven't thought about." The idea was so absurd, so unthinkable, that Emily immediately dismissed it. "No, that's impossible. My mother would never do something like that. She's a good woman. She's just trying to help. Yes, I have seen it happen in movies, but my mother wouldn't do a thing like that." Rebecca nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. "I'm sure you're right, but maybe just keep an eye out. Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight. You said that each time your mom comes over, David would start coming home early, and at times he won't go to shop. I don't know, but I am curious. I don't think any man could be afraid of her mother-in-law like that. I think something else is happening that you don't know." "Something like what? Do you realize that we are talking about my biological mother here? Come on, my mother wouldn't do a thing like that. I know many men want her, and she had been involved with some of them ever since my father passed away, but not with David. She can't do that to me." "Emily, shine your eyes. What is eating the yam might be inside the yam," Rebecca warned. Emily left the cafe feeling disturbed, Rebecca's words echoing in her mind like a haunting melody. She tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling herself that her friend was simply overthinking things, seeing shadows where there were none. But the doubt lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. When she returned home that evening, she was greeted by the familiar sight of her mother and David sitting in the living room. They were seated on opposite ends of the couch, but there was a tension in the air, a charged silence that made her stomach twist. Her mother looked up, a smile plastered on her face, but there was something in her eyes that made Emily's heart race. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to notice more. The stolen glances, the lingering touches, the hushed conversations that would fall silent whenever she entered the room. Each new observation added fuel to the fire of suspicion that Rebecca had ignited, until Emily could no longer ignore the possibility that something was terribly wrong. One evening, after putting her baby to bed, Emily decided to take drastic action. She called her mother, feigning an excuse about being out late, testing to see what would happen if she wasn't expected home. Margaret seemed unfazed, her voice calm as she assured Emily that everything would be fine. Emily's heart pounded as she hung up, her mind racing with the horrible possibility that Rebecca's warning might be true. She took a cab home, her hands trembling as she replayed the last few months in her mind, every detail taking on a new, sinister significance. When she arrived at her house, she found the living room empty, a strange stillness hanging in the air. She moved through the house on tiptoe, her steps silent as she made her way down the hall. Her heart was pounding, her breaths shallow as she approached her bedroom door. As she reached for the handle, she hesitated, a part of her unwilling to face the truth she had been avoiding for so long. But the doubt, the suspicion that had festered in her mind, pushed her forward. She opened the door quietly, her gaze sweeping over the room, and then she saw them. Her mother and her husband, tangled together in her own bed, oblivious to her presence. For a moment, Emily could only stare, her mind numb as the horrific reality settled over her like a suffocating blanket. The betrayal was so profound, so shattering, that she felt as though the ground had fallen out from beneath her. Everything she had believed, every sacrifice she had made, crumbled to dust before her eyes. Her mother's head turned, her eyes meeting Emily's with a look of shock and guilt. David pulled away, his face pale as he realized they had been caught. But Emily could see no remorse in his eyes, only anger and defiance, as though she were the intruder in her own life. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive, until Emily felt a scream rise in her throat, a scream that held every ounce of pain, betrayal, and heartbreak she had endured. "Mom, why David? With all the men outside, you choose my husband." She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she ran from the life she had once believed was her salvation, her heart shattered into a million pieces. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to my channel. Thanks.